on that.
Okay, so here's our two invasive dry-sended mussels in Lake St. Clair. The zebra mussel, which is this fella right here, is flat on the posterior side here, and they attach pretty flat like that to the animal. These guys over here on the other side are quagga mussels, which are in the same genus as the zebra mussel, and they're really a more recent introduction. And you can see on the bottom here they have a sort of a beveled shape. That's the easiest way to tell them apart. But some of the smaller ones here you can see, this is a quagga mussel actually, but they have that zebra-like pattern on there, which is why the zebra's got the name.
Zebra and quagga mussels are both from the Black and Caspian Sea region of Eastern Europe. That's their native range. They've spread all over the place, and they've spread very effectively because of their life history and their ability to survive through in ballast water tanks, which isn't a really nice place for a freshwater organism to survive. In the late 1800s, with the construction of canals, they were able to move very easily from Eastern Europe into Western Europe, and they've survived there for the last 100 or so years. They invaded Great Britain. They've invaded Ireland actually fairly recently, only in the late 90s. And then, of course, they came across the ocean, and they've invaded at first the Great Lakes. They secondarily invaded into the Mississippi, probably through either ballast water or through kind of private boaters moving their boats or bait buckets or something like that throughout the Mississippi drainage. And quagga mussels have now even invaded into Nevada and California, into Lake Powell, which is basically dammed up portions of the Grand Canyon, where they're wreaking havoc right now, in having population densities in the order of millions per square meter. Warmer water, highly productive, nice desert environment, lots of sunlight, lots of phytoplankton, and they've gone crazy. So they've spread from their kind of innocuous home in Eastern Europe, where they really were just part of the ecosystem, to areas of North America that were naive to them. There's no equivalent to a zebra mussel or quagga mussel native to North America. All of the native bivalves are infaunal, so they all live in the substrate. There's no epifaunal native bivalve to North America, so they exploited an empty niche, and they've gone crazy since then. The zebra mussel invaded first in the mid-1980s. Ground zero for the zebra mussel invasion is Lake St. Clair. They were first discovered on the south side of Lake St. Clair, not far from Windsor, in 1988. By the age of the shell that was found, they figured that it had been there for a year or two. So a paper was published very shortly after that by Dr. Polly Bear and Dr. Jerry Mackey, and they announced to the world basically that zebra mussels had arrived in North America. Not usually good news, and it had been predicted for a number of years that zebra mussels were likely to come in. There was studies done by the EPA saying that these are the likely candidates that are going to cause the most problems, and the prophecy quite literally came true. It's unfortunate that they knew that this problem was likely going to happen, but they did very little do about it. So the way that this happened is that a transoceanic freighter arrived in the Great Lakes with ballast water that was stored inside its ballast tanks, and ballast tanks are necessary in order to keep the boat from sitting at a certain level in the water so that it doesn't get inundated and it doesn't tip over and so on. So it's really something that's necessary, but when you fill up a boat's ballast tanks, and these are sometimes thousands of liters, you're sucking in water from the port that you start at. And that sucks in all sorts of things from the benthos to the water column. It can have all sorts of larvae in it, it could have even live animals in it. And this is how all sorts of invasive species have arrived into the Great Lakes. Zebra mussels, gobies, all sorts of other, some of the spiny water flea and stuff. There's some of that. Lots of species have arrived via ballast water transfer. So these things then come into the Great Lakes, and they have to sit fairly low in the water in order to be most efficient to get across the ocean. And then when they get into the Great Lakes, they get into some shallower waters. And in order to get into Lake St. Clair, some of them have to dump their ballast tanks in order to sit higher in the water. And what happened is that, and this seems to be often the case why Lake St. Clair and the Detroit River are the first places, is because everywhere else, Lake Ontario into the Welland Canal and Lake Erie, it's deep enough for them to maintain a very high draft and sit low in the water. But into Lake St. Clair, they have to sit higher. They dump those ballast tanks and release the organisms that are in their ballast tanks, and that's where they start finding a lot of these organisms in the Great Lakes. Other than being bivalve mollusks, they're not closely related at all. Phylogenetically, they're as distant as we are to, say, a rat or something like that. They're very distant from one another. Phylogenetically, evolutionarily, have very different life histories. Native freshwater mussels are what we call infaunal bivalves. They live in the substrate. Zebra mussels and quagga mussels are epifaunal bivalves. They live outside the substrate on top of something. They have byssal threads to hold onto the substrate that they live on, and they have very different life history in that the native mussels require host fish to complete their life cycle, and the zebra mussel and quagga mussel have external fertilization. They release their gametes. They have fertilization. They form a veliger larva, which is free floating and then floats onto whatever available surface that's nearby. The zebra mussel is therefore able to produce massive numbers of offspring and successfully reproduce them, whereas there's actual parental care in some of the native mussels. The females actually brood their larvae. They have to attract or have an available host fish. It's a little bit complex, and it can have, if it's interfered with, and can cause the recruitment failure and so on. So they're very different. The zebra mussels are very successful invaders because of their life history as well. Native mussels, very poor invaders relatively. They can move, but they're very nicely adapted to live in streams because they use that host fish. Zebra mussel will there's larvae will constantly be flushed downstream, whereas a native mussel, using the host fish, the host fish will be able to transport its larvae upstream very easily. So very adapted for living in streams. Zebra mussel more adapted, and actually its closest common ancestors probably most closely related to something marine. So they're living in a more adapted to like a lake environment or a marine environment. And we see that in areas where zebra mussels have invaded inland from the Great Lakes. We see that they're best able to survive in reservoirs behind dams, and then they can infest streams downstream, but their infestation levels aren't as high as what they would be in some of the lakes.